Hello there. My name is Carrie, and today I'm thinking we'll talk about composition. I mean, we could talk about something else, maybe pro wrestling or, I did put this whole thing together, so let's get rad and talk about composition. Yeah! Buttsplosion, yeah. So the idea of composition is probably not a new one to you, but I always find listening to different people talk about it is kind of enlightening, so let's do that. So what's a composition? It's simply an arrangement of visual elements. So you define an area, you put some elements in there, and it's a composition. The trick is, how do you make a good composition? Well, in a lot of visual arts, the composition of elements is usually about leading the eye around, giving the viewer significant things to look at and think about, and doing so in a way that's pleasing to our eyes and brains. Since our brains are really set up to perceive the contrast between things more than anything else, you can get pretty far in accomplishing those things simply by thinking about various kinds of contrast, all working together in a composition. So what kind of basic contrast can we employ in making an image? Well, given a bunch of identical elements, you could employ contrasts in value. Value! Oh, horrible jokes. Just forget you saw that. So value is pretty simple. It's just the brightness of an object. Here are 4 circles, all of the same value. They're all exactly the same. You look at this and you think, yay, 4 circles is an awesome party. Now, you vary the value of them, and what do we have? Well, each circle is a little different now, and the lower left certainly stands out from the rest. And it stands out because its value is the furthest by far from the others. Its value stands in contrast to the others. Same thing happens when you have lots and lots of elements. So here's like 75 circles. They're still all the same. Change the values, and suddenly a small group of them stands out, and one of them seems particularly important. None of those black ones stand out because they're all the same, but your brain really pays attention to that one that's different. It's more noticeable and it seems more important, so your eye keeps going back there to try to figure out why it's special, as opposed to sitting on any of the others. So what's happening here? Obviously not much. None of them stand out. Your eye kind of goes all over the place and gets bored and doesn't want to look at it anymore. But even just randomly varying the values of the circles, now your eye kind of starts to see some areas are more interesting than others. Some shapes are kind of popping out. Not a whole lot, but it's something. So what if we start playing with scale? So scale refers to how big various elements are. I know, right? I had to look in the dictionary. And weight is a term that some people use to differentiate from scale when talking about lines specifically. And it just refers to how thick a line is. So line weight is really just talking about the scaling of a width of a line. So we'll take weight and scale together. It's kind of all the same. If we look again at our circles of different value, we see they're all exactly the same bigness. Their embiggenment levels are the same. That's technical speak you don't need to worry about. So what if we go ahead and vary the scale of one of these at random? Now we have one that really sticks out. It's become important by virtue of its scale relative to the others. Your eye looks at it first, and looks at it more often, and more than it looks elsewhere. Because even amongst a field of circles that all have something different about them, this one's different in a different way. Okay, so let's make them all different sizes. Now you have a few that seem to stand out for various reasons. We're seeing some of them as background stuff, and some of them as foreground stuff, and here's where we start seeing significant shapes and details in the composition, like this sort of swoop in the middle, because this random scaling has had some impact on another contrast, density. Now you can totally qualify density and detail as 2 different things, but they're interrelated, as are most of the things we'll talk about in a minute. And density inherently creates detail, as is happening with our clearly super cool circle composition. Some of these areas in the composition are densely packed, and some are really empty. You could also say that these areas have high detail, and these have low or no detail. These dense parts are areas of interest, specifically because there's not much to look at over here. This is where the excitement is for your eyes. And I mean, look at that. Wow, that's super exciting. You can still see how the density creates detail even when we make all of the values the same. All evened out, we kind of get these lines of interest here. So now instead of just scaling, let's have the elements congregate by moving them around. The contrast in density is even higher now, and you can pretty clearly see where your eye is hanging out the most here in this group. There are other points of significance you'll find your attention flitting back to, but mainly because they're stuck out here by their lonesome, poor little guys. But the meat of this image for your eyes is here in the center. This is eye meat. Delicious, delicious eye meat. There's not much tasty detail out here. Lots of detail here. We can push them around again and get different densities, and therefore a different composition. Something that density can greatly affect is the order in which your eye reads an image. Now for a simple image like this, your eye is sorting it out really fast, probably faster than you even realize since you're sorting things in your visual field pretty much all day long, every day. But what's probably happening is that upon first seeing it, your eye is going either here or here. Since this group is kind of cropped out of the frame, this group in the center is deemed more important. Now the frame is dictating to us the focus of this image, as if we were looking through a camera at something. Clearly this stuff is what we're looking at, and this isn't so much, or it wouldn't be kind of framed out of the composition. The pretend camera that took this picture wasn't nearly as interested in this stuff, and is trying to show you this stuff. That doesn't mean the eye doesn't still try to go there and see if there's anything interesting, but this center detail is clearly the focus. Now that's a lot to say about some kind of dumb circles. I mean super awesome circles. These are obviously more badass than average circles, so let's introduce something else to stand against them. What? Shapes? Are we allowed to do shapes? We can do a lot with circles. I mean, we could push these basic contrasts a lot further, make one of the circles huge amongst hundreds of little ones or whatever, but you know, there's more to life than circles. Seriously, have you tried Pop-Tarts? They're rectangles. Amazing. In honor of Pop-Tarts, let's put a Pop-Tart in here. It's on its edge. We're looking along the Pop-Tart's frosted surface. It's like fancy perspective. Clearly this is the best illustration of a Pop-Tart I've ever done. This portion of the video is brought to you by Kellogg's, who I think make Pop-Tarts, but I'm probably wrong. Okay, look at how the straight lines and hard angles of the Pop-Tart stand out against all them circles. That little thing is getting a lot of attention for being the unique shape in the composition. It gets your attention just by having a different shape. It's not because it's big, because look, still something your brain considers at least as much as any of these little background circles. Despite how small it is now, it still vies for attention with the other important features of the composition. Granted, this isn't an interesting image, of course, but we're talking about the mechanisms of perception, not whether this is inspiring, because it's not. But the way the brain works, that little sliver gets a lot of scrutiny just by having a different shape. But in this particular instance, it's actually doing something else too. It's indicating direction. Now, when we say direction and movement, we're not talking about animation or anything actually moving, of course. We're talking firstly about how the elements are kind of pulling the eye around the composition, and in what order. Basically, the movement of the eye as guided by the composition. And secondly, we're talking about implied motion in the elements or the space between them. In our current composition, we have some direction and movement implied, and the sliver is actually arranged perpendicular to that direction. Here's the direction that this element is indicating. Now, if you look at just the circles, you can sort of see they're working together to create these general shapes, and the negative space between them is creating these shapes. Everything's kind of pointing on average to the lower right-hand corner. It's not explicit, it's a vague suggestion because there's all these stray bits and it's kind of disordered, but as a viewer, your brain is constantly working at light speed to figure out patterns and shapes and directions, so it takes these suggestions. So you can see how this is standing in opposition to that direction and that implied movement. Not only is it the only non-round thing, it's also cutting across all the movement. So if we go ahead and align it with the general movement of the other elements, it feels like they work together a little better, or like they're headed in the same direction. It's still grabbing attention because of its shape, but it's not fighting the direction. So what's happening now is that there's a visual pull to the lower right. The direction or implied movement is suggesting a new point of focus down there. And what tends to happen is that when the direction is strong enough, the viewer's eye will move along it to see where it goes. You can see how a lot of visual artists use this very knowingly, and sometimes in really complex ways, to move the eye through a composition or to move it around the composition. Sometimes you'll create movement for the eye, and sometimes you'll break that movement for contrast or effect. Just depends on what you're trying to do, but always be aware of where the movement is and how it may or may not be pulling the eye around the frame. You can use any of the basic contrast to create movement. You could even use cats? Let's talk about texture. I thought we were going to be looking at white circles all day. Now, some people might say texture is just a special kind of detail, but I think it's helpful to think about it in its own right. Now, we could think of texture in a couple different ways, really. First, as in the surface qualities of elements we've included in the frame. Here are a couple circles with flat, unbroken white texture. Oh boy, how innovative. Now you might say that they have no texture, but let's think about them as both having the same texture, that being flat white. But because their texture is exactly the same, there's no contrast between them. Their value is the same, their scale, their density is kind of irrelevant, and their shape is the same. And overlapping as they are, you can't see where one ends and the other begins because of the lack of contrast. By changing the texture of each, we get contrast. The overall value of each circle, if you squint your eyes or have really bad eyesight, is still fairly similar, but now we perceive the left circle and the right distinctly, simply because their textures are different. And so it goes for pretty much everything your eyes are looking at. But this is a low level of contrast. What if we do the same thing with more drastically different textures? Here are two fabrics, still roughly a stack of diagonal lines on the left and a grid of dark points on the right, but now all kinds of new details are available to differentiate them. And the values of each are considerably different. Here's kind of the same thing with two metals. You'll notice that the more contrasty combos we're looking at here contrast because they employ most of the strategies we already looked at. The values here are offset. There's a noticeable difference in the scale of significant details, and so with the density. On the left, we have large diagonal rectangles and lines which are a distinctly different set of shapes from the right with its irregular dotted shapes and overall kind of smoother appearance. And the orderly crisscrossing directions on the left are also different than the relatively directionless forms on the right. Okay, so it's pretty obvious how that works. And you can use less contrast in the textures of objects successfully, or more when you need to differentiate between them and pull focus to an element. But there's another way to create texture we've already seen, and that's to use the density, detail, direction, and so forth of the elements in your composition as a whole. So if we look back at this grid, it's creating a texture. When we vary the value of these elements, it affects that texture. Your eye starts trying to distinguish details and shapes, like some of the lines and right angles that sort of appear here, when all we did was apply a bunch of random values. And varying the density and so on also impacts that texture, because again, texture is really a bunch of little details contrasting in certain ways, and your brain is trying to make sense of those details. It's always looking for the contrast between them, and sometimes the meaning of them, which is more obvious in the case of the fire and water. I mean, you know it's fire and water. The images have contrast, but your mind also understands the general meaning of those textures. So texture is powerful both for compositional reasons and as an actual visual signifier of meaning. And of course, you probably noticed that another type of contrast is available here, which is color. Now, I'm bad at color. I don't even understand how crayons work. I eat them. But clearly here, the hue and the saturation are very dissimilar. And here's the circles again, when their hue, saturation, and value are exactly the same as the background. If we shift just the hue of the right circle by 120 degrees, we can suddenly distinguish it by color contrast. Shift the hue of the left circle by 120 in the other direction, and there it is. There is no other contrast in this image, just color. Not even the saturation of the color, just the hue. So clearly that's useful, and there's whole books on color theory out there, so we're not going to try to get into that here because I have to go eat crayons. But we can still talk about the last of the contrast, which is depth. And depth refers to having elements which appear to be in front of or behind each other, implying foreground stuff and background stuff. It can be implied in a bunch of different ways, though, by using perspective and scaling objects depending on whether they're meant to be close or far, by having objects overlap and include each other so it looks like they're in front of or behind something. You could use atmospheric fog in the case of large distances. You can use lighting and shadows to indicate the various sides and locations of elements and to give them volume. And by using focal length, as in the blurring of objects that are too close or far from the point of focus of a camera or an eye. There are a lot of subtle ways to suggest depth, and again, not that you need to, but everything in the real world that we're looking at all the time has depth, and we're built to see in depth, so it's an effective way, again, to lead the eye or tell a story or make something visceral. So there's a refresher of the basic contrast, and I think it's a pretty good way to classify and organize them. And the goal of keeping these in mind isn't necessarily to maximize on using them all at once, it's really to be aware that they're available to help you craft the image you need, because of course it's totally possible to create engaging imagery that's relatively low contrast. And it's also totally possible to effectively use just a couple of these contrasts at a time. But what's cool is how you can use them in more complex ways in order to guide your audience through your imagery in a more interesting way. So let's just take a look at a few examples of compositional strategies you can use by thinking about the contrast in different ways. Here we go. Now you're probably groaning, because negative space is kind of a well-worn topic, so I won't say much, but it really speaks to using the basic contrasts. So typically, to guide the eye around and focus a viewer on something, you create areas of interest and areas of not so interesting. You know, areas of density versus not so much density, and lots of detail versus little detail, or maybe elements that stand out in regions of sameness. Basically, you're creating interest here and not here, so someone's eye knows where to go. When there's the same level of detail everywhere, the eye has a hard time focusing on any of it. It's totally fine to put detail everywhere, but in the design industry, typically we're trying to communicate something specifically and usually quickly. So employing strategies to generate interest in and focus attention on something in specific is pretty useful. Now, negative space is really just those areas that are there to hold up the interesting stuff without distracting from it too much. Some people call it white space. Whatever, it's all the same. It's those spaces that aren't going to attract your eye immediately, so that your eye isn't flying all over the place trying to figure out what to look at. Negative space can still be full of things to look at as long as they aren't screaming for attention. You know, something we touched on briefly is the order in which the eye reads an image. So your eye scans your environment and you sort out what everything is super fast, right? We're built to do that because it's defensive. Of course, 100,000 years ago, if something dropped out of a tree, you wanted to be able to see it and understand whether it was a branch or a poisonous snake about as fast as possible. Now, there's not likely to be anything imminently deadly around while you're on your computer in your underwear like I might be, but your brain is still set up to do it, and it's doing it all the time. And so it goes with looking at images. As soon as you look at something new, your brain is working on identifying silhouettes and patterns and figuring out what's important or interesting. And there are ways to quickly signal to the eye that this thing or that thing is important or more important than the other things. And again, that comes down to using contrast effectively. And what happens when you use that contrast effectively is that certain things pop out to the eye first. And after the split second of looking at those things passes, it moves on to secondary and tertiary points of interest. And depending on where these things are in your composition, the eye is more or less following a path around the image to look at them. So your composition can, to a certain degree, manipulate what's seen first and second and maybe third, and that means it can kind of guide the eye around the frame. Now, that can make the viewing experience less distracted and more pleasing. But it's also a useful tool when you want to convey information in a specific order, and is why we sometimes talk about the hierarchy of importance in an image. It's the same reason why in a print ad certain things are big and bold and attractive, and certain things like legal copy are almost unnoticeable. They want to get you interested enough first that the legal bummer down below doesn't burst your bubble. So take a look at this ad and figure out what the first thing you recognized was, and the second and the third. Oh my god, it's McDonald's, French fries. Wait, no, they tricked you into getting excited about vegetables by manipulating the read order. But they also did so by using another hard-coded mechanism of perception, the silhouette. The way we're set up, the first thing our visual system looks for is silhouettes. It looks for significant shapes, meaning it's using the high contrast edges of what it's looking at to identify where significant objects are, and then what those objects are. Now this happens every time you look at anything. It's happening right now. What was that? You know exactly what it was, despite it being just a shape with no internal detail. It wasn't even a very well-defined shape. Look at this. The edge detail is pretty crappy, but you still knew what it was. And you know it's different than this. These are both people, males in fact, and one is adult and possibly infirmed, and the other is very young, and you knew that with very little to go on. Don't get a big head about it or anything. Everybody can do this, which is what makes it powerful when making imagery. Obviously, most stuff you look at isn't as clean and contrasty as this, so it stands to reason that your brain is super good at discerning the silhouettes of different things, even when there's lots of detail going on. And it pulls lots of information from the silhouette, which is easy to see even when the internal detail is kind of non-specific. This is clearly a robot vehicle of some kind, despite the internal detail being mostly mush. And you might think that when the internal detail is really specific, that's the most immediately interesting to the eye, but it's actually not. you still end up picking out and deciphering the major shapes first before moving on to more minor shapes and details. Look at this, you pick out the high contrast things like the face and maybe this green block, but even though the rest of the image is stuffed with little details, you still end up figuring out this is a woman in a dress. The highest contrast shapes in this future city image are here, and they immediately give you a lot of info. Then you go to work picking out the silhouettes of smaller internal shapes like these. Now, all this is to say that silhouettes are important, and that we discriminate between them very quickly and easily, which means you can really convey a lot about certain elements by focusing simply on the shapes that they make. Now, sometimes it's helpful to put some elements at the edge of the frame. Firstly, to imply that there's stuff outside the frame and that we're looking at what's inside the frame because it's important and not just because there's nothing else to look at. It helps focus a viewer's attention to what is inside the frame, because when the eye wanders to the edge to see what it's missing, it kind of gets bounced back in by virtue of that stuff being cropped off. Again, think of the frame as a camera. When you point a camera at something, it's because that's where your attention is. You point your eyes at something because that's momentarily where your attention is. When someone else is looking at your frame or a photograph you've taken, it's a little like they're looking through your eyes for a second and being focused on what you were focused on. What's outside the frame is generally uninteresting in that moment, and what's inside is important. I mean, that's what's implied anyway. When you walk up to a white wall with a picture hung on it, you don't spend much time inspecting the wall, right? Not unless you're really weird. So having some things out here can serve a few different purposes. In some instances, it can help to anchor the imagery to the frame so that things aren't seen to be floating so much. Meaning, if all your stuff is in here, it's slightly less relevant where the frame is or what its shape is. In some instances, it can suggest that there's a bigger picture and that there's stuff outside the frame not being shown, which can potentially either be frustrating to a viewer or can make them curious. And certain shapes can also provide guidance for the eyes to keep them moving around these areas instead of being distracted by anything non-essential. It can be kind of a boundary effect when the eyes scan out to the edges and go, this isn't as interesting as this stuff, so I'm going back in here. Which kind of helps the eye keep moving mostly in the areas that you want it to. And since we tend mostly to make compositions in rectangular frames, it can also have the added effect of making the effective shape of the frame non-regular and more engaging. So that's just a simple strategy for thinking about what's beyond the frame, maybe hinting at it, and in doing so drawing the viewer's eyes in. Like all these things, you can use it for effect, or intentionally not use it, again for effect. Just something you can be aware of and keep in your toolkit. And again, each of these are just strategies amongst many strategies that use the basic contrast in different ways. Negative space is about a strategic use of detail and density. Read order is about using scale or value or any of the contrast really to build a hierarchy of what's important. Silhouette is really using contrast to make strong edges for elements that need to stand out or carry important information. It's really that simple. And there's a bunch of other stuff like the rule of thirds, golden proportions, symmetry and asymmetry, and so forth that are all helpful to keep in your back pocket. But understanding how to wield these ideas about contrast at every level can really go a long way toward making engaging imagery that people just like looking at, so that you can present them with ideas or stories that then mean something to them. Now, having just said that, let's make a real quick composition that basically doesn't mean squat. Let's kind of stick to our circle theme here and use texture and value and density in all of our goodies to make something that's legible and feels intentional. So I'm just going to start out with, a basic circle and just kind of hack away at it until I figure out what it is that feels right. And for me, that involved, bringing in some texture, starting to create an element that, maybe that doesn't necessarily mean something, but that maybe feels like something or evokes some kind of mood. I think this little roundel is a nice way to kind of start creating a focus for the image. Maybe this could be something that we try to direct attention to in the composition. And the secondary circle is just, the exact same thing. We're just attempting to start to create an idea of what's going to be in the image, how this composition is going to work. And so I'm starting to think like, okay, well, let's pick a spot in the frame and make it the focus. Let's just start building stuff out in that frame. And at this point, I'm starting to think, okay, well, I started out with something kind of metal, chrome. Maybe I'll make something kind of like machine-like, and And that's just an idea to allow me to make things. Otherwise, I'm just sort of aimlessly making shapes and throwing textures in there, and you usually end up with just a bunch of garbage when that's the way, well, at least that's the way it works for me. So now I'm thinking, well, okay, let's make some significant shapes other than circles and see what we come up with. You can kind of see how there's sort of lower left to upper right kind of movement, and a couple other things going on. But it's pretty simple, and I'm keeping the composition fairly flat, and just sort of like trying to feel out all these different, like sort of where all the different contrasts are going to go. You know, what is the texture in the upper right versus in the middle? You know, where's the direction heading? Is there a significant flow to it? And just kind of experimenting on all fronts at the same time. So I've kind of already made the decision to make this kind of, you know, these panels, and I really just need to focus on, okay, well, what sort of details are going to be in there, like these wires. The composition is fairly well set, but I need to go ahead and build in some more contrasts so that some of these things are more legible and more interesting to look at. So, you know, you can see how there are some detail lines. There's this background image in the upper right. There are different textures going on, slightly different color sets, and I think that, you know, in general, this isn't like a super dynamic composition, but it kind of illustrates how just using the principles, just paying attention to the difference in line weights, how they sit next to each other, the difference in values and how those values butt up next to each other, you know, it starts to make a legible image. And well, actually, at this point, I realized that the whole dirty gold texture wasn't really interesting to me at all. So, and I wanted to do something that was a little bit brighter, a little bit more contrasty, honestly. So I went for this strictly black and white kind of composition. The textures are a little bit more toned down, everywhere except for in that initial medallion that I had made, and I think that helps pull focus to that medallion, which was sort of the original goal. And you know, I think that's a successful way to think about building a composition, especially if you're trying to pull attention to one thing or another. So the direction being sort of lower left to upper right in general, and then also there are these significant shapes like this sort of horizontal black band and the diagonal black band. I think that they all kind of tend to pull attention towards that area where that medallion is. And then the additional details can help fill it out. And now I'm actually just adding a little bit of depth because I realize that this is really flat, and I don't want to go something super dynamic for some reason, but I thought it maybe just needed a little bit of shadowing. And that's where I chose to leave it. You can work this sort of thing until you're dead, but this does what it needs to, and I actually did 2 other images with hiccups on the recording, so I'm pretty stoked we've actually got something to look at this point. Now, the focus of this image isn't so strong that it's screaming, but the eye is still drawn there for a few reasons. The first is that this medallion is the point of highest density and detail, and not by much, but enough. It also features this texture, which is bright relative to its surroundings, and has a whole lot of detail, and it isn't featured anywhere else, so it's unique in the composition. There also aren't any elements obstructing it, which suggests that it's a foreground object, and there are also significant shapes implying a sort of convergence in the area of that medallion. And these circles, too, that kind of create a line along which it falls. There are also some lighting touches, too, to darken up the corners and contain the light in the upper right, so that it seems to be casting mostly directly on that object. Now, all these things could be stronger and more definitive, but we don't necessarily need anything to be screaming here. So if we really get down and look at the details where they're densest, you can see lots of contrast playing out at a small scale to make those details pop against each other. Contrasting values butting up against each other, variations in the scale of lines and their distances from each other, and in the textural qualities too. All this stuff helps each shape delineate itself from its neighbor and create that density when we pull back to look at it again. As for depth, there's not a lot, but it's not completely flat either. These panels are clearly in front of whatever this underlying machinery is, And this panel is maybe popped out a bit in front of these white panels. Then these foreground panels at the edges are on top of everything else. If let's say this whole thing were a physical object or a 3D model, we could shoot it in deep perspective and drastically increase the amount of depth in the image. But right now, we're just looking straight on and using simple strategies for depth, like shadows and putting things in front of and behind each other. The net effect is that it's decent to look at and reads well, and we've done it just by kind of paying attention to each of these strategies and balancing them out. So hopefully that's a good refresher. It's always kind of helpful to go back to the basics every so often because there's never really an end to figuring out how to use them. So keep at it, and I'll see you next time.